topic for today is Darwin's response to his critics and its relevance for today. Before I actually get into the topic, I thought I would first give a little bit of information about how I got interested in this topic. I was an international tax lawyer for 37 years, and some might be wondering, what's an international tax lawyer doing talking about Darwin's theory of evolution? But actually, I've been interested in evolution ever since I was a little kid. I remember way back when I was in elementary school in Houston, Texas, my class, I believe it was my 4th grade class, was going to go on a field trip to Herman Park Zoo. For some reason, I always liked the name of that park, Herman Park, although it has 2 ends. I have only 1 end. So I was very excited about going to the zoo and seeing a lot of the amazing animals that God had created. But I remember after we got to the zoo and we were going from exhibit to exhibit, evolution was a constant theme of the zoo. Often information provided about a creature would talk about how it was perfectly adapted to its environment through the operation of natural selection. And the implication was that this all happened through natural processes. So I was a little disappointed, but I thought, well, if that's what the scientists say, that's the way things happen, then it must be true. I had a lot of respect for scientists and just assumed they were honest and trustworthy and would not present something as fact if, in fact, they did not know it to be fact. So I just kind of accepted evolution as the way all the amazing creatures on Earth had come into being. My 8th grade biology class did not focus much on evolution, but my 10th grade biology class was very much dominated by it. In fact, the curriculum was titled From Molecules to Man. It taught very explicitly the neo-Darwinian theory. That is, the theory that the first form of life originated in the primordial soup through random chance processes, and then all forms of life thereafter, including human beings, were produced through the process of natural selection, operating on randomly produced genetic mutations. So that was in 10th grade. In 12th grade, when I was a senior, I decided to take an advanced biology class that my high school was offering. I was planning to take 1 more year of Spanish, but I had already taken 7 years of Spanish, and I decided that was enough, so I signed up for the advanced biology course. In that course, we really got into the complexity of all kinds of living organisms, including their biochemical complexity. And the more I thought about the diversity and complexity of life, the more I started wondering whether neo-Darwinian theory really made sense. Excuse me. Then I went off to college, graduate school, law school, and became an international tax lawyer. But all this time I kept thinking about neo-Darwinian theory and kept having real questions about whether it was a reasonable theory. It didn't seem able to explain the simplest things. For example, why do we have teeth only in our mouths and not elsewhere on our bodies, such as on our elbows? Moreover, predictions I would make based on the theory were not borne out by reality. So I was having these issues, these questions about evolution, whether it really made sense. I remembered that when I was in school, I didn't hear any arguments against the theory. So I decided to do some research on current biology textbooks being used in public schools and discovered that none of them presented any arguments against the theory. I thought this was weird, especially when a theory is being taught that leads kids to believe they're the product of random chance processes. One textbook I looked at openly stated that evolution has shown that we were not created for any special purpose or pursuant to any universal design. And in fact, it's common for biologists and biology teachers to take the position that all species, including human beings, are here by accident, and all the beauty and complexity of nature came about through chance. Given the dire consequences that neo-Darwinian theory can have for society, it seemed obvious that it needed to be taught objectively, with the scientific arguments both pro and con presented. Yet when I would propose to scientists, science teachers, or policymakers that evolutionary theory be taught objectively, many would react very strongly against the idea and simply say, there are no arguments against evolution. They probably also thought I was a nutcase for even questioning neo-Darwinian theory. I got to wondering, how could I get people to understand that there are, in fact, real scientific arguments against the theory? I wondered whom evolutionists would listen to. And I realized that one person all evolutionists should listen to is Charles Darwin. After all, he was the one who originated the theory. So I decided to closely study his book, The Origin of Species. And I found that he spent a lot of time addressing scientific arguments against his theory. In fact, by the time of the 6th edition in 1872, about 1/3 of his book was spent addressing scientific arguments raised by his critics. So I decided to focus on Darwin's response to his critics and develop an article on that topic, hopefully to get evolutionists to be a little bit more open-minded and see that there are, in fact, strong arguments against the theory. So that's a little background about how I got interested in this topic. Now I would like to give a little background about Darwin and his theory, and then I'll get into his response to his critics. Charles Robert Darwin was born in Shrewsbury, England on February 12, 1809. Incidentally, that's the same day Abraham Lincoln was born, in a one-room log cabin in LaRue County, Kentucky. Darwin's father, Robert, had a large medical practice, and his grandfather, Erasmus, was a physician who is known for his book, The Laws of Organic Life. In 1825, when Darwin was 16, his father sent him to the University of Edinburgh to study medicine. However, Darwin showed a lack of enthusiasm for medicine, and in 1827, his father decided to send him to study divinity at the University of Cambridge. Unfortunately, his academic record there was also less than stellar. In 1831, after graduating from Cambridge, Darwin went on a 3-week geological expedition to North Wales under the leadership of the famous geologist Adam Sedgwick. Incidentally, that geologist would later become a strong critic of Darwin's theory of natural selection. Darwin had been recommended for the expedition by John Stevens Henslow, a minister and botanist at Cambridge. In August 1831, also upon the recommendation of Henslow, Darwin was invited to join the voyage of the HMS Beagle. The ship was to survey the east and west coast of South America and then continue to the Pacific Islands to establish a chain of chronometric stations, which were used for determining longitude. The ship already had a naturalist surgeon as part of the crew, but the captain, Robert Fitzroy, found Darwin to be a more pleasant conversationalist and so agreed to take Darwin on as an unpaid naturalist. On December 27, 1831, the Beagle set sail from Plymouth, England. The voyage was originally intended to last 2 years, but instead lasted 5. Darwin was seasick during much of the voyage, but still managed to record detailed observations of many species and geological formations. In 1836, the Beagle returned to England. After returning to England, Darwin was supported by his father and continued to collect facts about many species through extensive reading and through conversations and correspondence with other naturalists and with breeders and gardeners. The scientific community in London also helped him better understand the specimens that had been collected during the voyage of the Beagle. After marrying his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, in January 1839, Darwin was supported by his wife's wealth and was able to continue his career as an independent naturalist until the day he died. Darwin was very impressed with the production of new varieties by man through, quote, the long-continued selection of the best individuals in successive generations, close quote. And he began theorizing about a similar process in nature, which he called natural selection. In 1842, 6 years after having returned from his voyage, Darwin prepared a short sketch of his theory. In 1844, he prepared a longer version and showed it to his friend Joseph Dalton Hooker, a botanist. However, Darwin then spent the next decade working on a treatise on barnacles. In 1856, he decided to return to the development of his theory and began writing a fuller exposition of it. On June 18, 1858, Darwin received a paper from Alfred Russel Wallace, a naturalist who was working in the Malay archipelago. The paper set forth the same theory of natural selection that Darwin had been working on for 20 years. Darwin was greatly disappointed because it appeared his life's work had been preempted by someone else. However, his friends Joseph Hooker, Charles Lyell, and T.H. Huxley arranged for papers by Darwin and Wallace to be presented at the Linnean Society of London on July 1, 1858, 2 weeks after Darwin had received Wallace's paper. The papers by Darwin and Wallace set forth their theory of natural selection. Incidentally, by 1869, Wallace had abandoned his theory of natural selection and subscribed to a theory of design. After Darwin's paper was presented at the Linnean Society, Darwin began in earnest an abstract of the longer manuscript he had begun in 1856. This so-called abstract became the book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, which is often referred to simply as The Origin of Species. The book was published on November 24, 1859. In the following years, Darwin published revisions of the book, and the last edition, the 6th edition, was published in 1872. Darwin died 10 years later on April 19, 1882, at his home in Down, England. Although today Darwin's theory is commonly called the theory of evolution, he rarely referred to it as that. To distinguish his theory from some general notion of evolution, Darwin usually referred to his theory as the theory of descent with modification. Under Darwin's theory, quote, animals are descended from at most only 4 or 5 progenitors, and plants from an equal or lesser number, close quote. However, he also suggested the possibility that, quote, all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth may be descended from some one primordial form, close quote. With respect to the origin of these first forms, or the first form, Darwin believed that, quote, life with its several powers was originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms, or into one, close quote. Darwin presumably believed these original forms of life constituted species. For Darwin, a new species was a, quote, well-marked and permanent, close quote, variety of an existing species. Having presented his general theory that every organism now on Earth descended from an originally created species, Darwin had to explain how this descent took place. To do this, he first had to account for the origin of new features in organisms. Darwin theorized that after the first species were created, some organisms experienced inheritable modifications, which he generally referred to as variations. Darwin believed that variations could arise from the direct, definite action of changed conditions of life, from laws of growth when one part is modified, including, quote, many mysterious cases of correlation, close quote, from the use or disuse of a feature, or from habit, for example, the inherited effects of compulsory training in the case of dogs. He also believed there were variations with unknown causes, which he sometimes referred to as spontaneous variations. Darwin also had to account for the origin of very complex features. Darwin contended that a great amount of variability will evidently be favorable, and believed that over time one favorable variation could be improved by another favorable variation, and so on, until after, quote, numerous successive slight modifications, close quote, a complex organ such as an eye or a lung might be produced. In order to explain why there are now millions of species instead of at most 8 to 10, that is the number of originally created species, Darwin theorized that a subgroup of a species could become isolated from the other members of the species and then develop new features of its own. Eventually, the subgroup would become significantly different and would constitute a new species, that is, a well-marked and permanent variety under Darwin's definition. Having accounted for the origin of new features, the origin of complex features, and the origin of new species, Darwin finally had to account for the absence of transitional forms in the world around us. This is where his theory of natural selection comes into play. Darwin theorized that when one member of a group has a favorable variation, that variation gives it a competitive advantage in the struggle for existence over other members of the group. And over time, members without that variation become extinct. Thus, there are distinct gaps between the species rather than, quote, an inextricable chaos of varying and intermediate links, close quote. Darwin called this process natural selection. However, this type of selection is different from the type of selection involved in breeding performed by man, that is, domestic selection. In the case of domestic selection, man is selecting the best individuals in successive generations and crossing them with other individuals of the same species with favorable traits. In the case of natural selection, what is occurring is extinction, the extinction of the less fit. Thus, it would be more appropriate to refer to natural selection as natural extinction. Darwin states that, quote, natural selection acts by life and death, by the survival of the fittest, by the destruction of the less well-fitted individuals, and thus extinction and natural selection go hand in hand, close quote. It is clear that natural selection, that is, natural extinction, results in the disappearance of features in a species, not in the appearance of new features. Thus, Darwin's theory consists of 4 parts. 1, an explanation of how new features arise. 2, an explanation of how complex features arise. 3, an explanation of why there are now millions of species. And 4, an explanation of why we do not see innumerable transitional forms in the world around us. Many of the most eminent naturalists of Darwin's time strongly opposed his theory. Among these were Louis Agassiz, a world-renowned professor of geology and biology at Harvard University, known as the father of the American scientific tradition. St. George Mivart, an English biologist who published On the Genesis of Species in 1871, Francois Jules Pictet, a Swiss zoologist and paleontologist, who was professor of zoology and comparative anatomy at the University of Geneva, Adam Sedgwick, who I mentioned earlier, professor of geology and paleontology at Cambridge University and one of Britain's most distinguished geologists, and Karl Nageli, a Swiss professor of botany at the University of Munich, who was famous for his work on plant cells. I should note that all of these 5 critics of Darwin's theory, they all subscribe to the theory of design. That is, the theory that all of the complexity and diversity of life on Earth is due to design by a super powerful, super intelligent being. I should also note that they all believed that, in addition, they all believed that the Earth was millions and millions of years old. Thus, they subscribed to design, but they were not young Earth creationists. Because Darwin's ideas were at odds with the general scientific thinking of the time, which was the theory of design, he took great care to reply to those who objected to his theory. By the time of the 6th edition of The Origin of Species, approximately 1/3 of the book consisted of Darwin's response to his critics. In The Origin of Species, Darwin addressed 37 objections raised by his critics. These objections concern the following topics: the difficulty of explaining the origin of complex organisms and organs, focusing specifically on bats, wings, eyes, lungs, and electric organs of fish. St. George Mivart's objections, he focused specifically on giraffes, insects that resemble various objects, but baleen plates of the Greenland whale, the eyes of the flatfish, mammary glands, injection of milk by a mother kangaroo, tridactyl forceps of starfish and sea urchins, avicularia of polyzoa and tridactyl forceps, the structure of the flowers of orchids, and the movements of climbing plants. Another objection was the difficulty of explaining the origin of parts with little importance, the difficulty of explaining the origin of characters with no importance, the difficulty of explaining a feature of one species that is for the exclusive good of another species, the difficulty of explaining the existence of similar organs in remotely allied species, the difficulty of explaining the existence of different organs for the same function in closely allied species, the difficulty of explaining how a new group can live side by side with its parent species, the difficulty of explaining how it is that many parts of an organism are modified at the same time, the difficulty of explaining the origin of complex instincts, focusing specifically on the instinct of the European cuckoo, the instinct of slave-making ants, and the cell-making instinct of the hive bee, the difficulty of explaining the coordination of structure and instinct, focusing specifically on the larger titmouse and neuter ants and their different caste, the difficulty of explaining the inability of a species to breed with another species, the absence of transitional forms in the world around us, the absence of transitional forms in the fossil record, the absence of transitional forms even within particular geological formations, the sudden appearance of new forms of life in certain geological formations, the Cambrian explosion, and insufficient time for the world species to have been produced through natural selection. So these are the objections to his theory that Darwin considered. Unfortunately, I do not have time to focus on Darwin's response to each objection. Instead, I'd like to highlight the objections that Darwin acknowledged were valid objections, some of which he even acknowledged carried great weight. In general, with respect to Darwin's response to his critics, he acknowledged that there were a crowd of difficulties with his theory and stated, quote, "Some of them are so serious that to this day, I can hardly reflect on them without being in some degree staggered. But to the best of my judgment, the greater number are only apparent, and those that are real are not, I think, fatal to the theory." Close quote. Now, moving ahead to what he said about eyes. With respect to the complexity of eyes and how they might have come into existence under his theory, Darwin states, quote, "To suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree," close quote. However, he then goes on to state that, quote, "The difficulty of believing that a perfect and complex eye could be formed by natural selection, though insuperable by our imagination, should not be considered as subversive of the theory," close quote. With respect to the electric organs of fish, Darwin states that, quote, the electric organs of fishes offer another case of special difficulty. For it is impossible to conceive by what steps these wondrous organs have been produced. But this is not surprising, for we do not even know of what use they are, close quote. In general, with respect to St. George Mivart's objections, Darwin states that Mivart has presented the objections with admirable art and force, and they make a formidable array. Now I'll pass through these slides that deal with St. George Mivart's objections, since we don't have time to cover every objection. I get to the giraffe's fly flapper, as Darwin called it. With respect to the difficulty of explaining the origin of parts with little importance, Darwin states, quote, I have sometimes felt great difficulty in understanding the origin or formation of parts of little importance, almost as great, though of a very different kind, as in the case of the most perfect and complex organs, close quote. He mentions the tail of the giraffe as an example of a part with little apparent importance. He states that it looks like an artificially constructed fly flapper, and quote, it seems at first incredible that this could have been adapted for its present purpose by successive slight modifications, each better and better fitted for so trifling an object as to drive away flies, close quote. With respect to the difficulty of explaining the origin of characters with no importance, Darwin states that one critic refers to the length of the ears and tails in different species of hares and mice and a multitude of analogous cases. And Darwin states, quote, there is much force in the above objection. With respect to the difficulty of explaining the existence of similar organs in remotely allied species, Darwin admits the difficulty under his theory of an organ apparently the same arising in several remotely allied species. With respect to the difficulty of explaining the origin of complex instincts, Darwin acknowledges, quote, many instincts are so wonderful that their development will probably appear to the reader a difficulty sufficient to overthrow my whole theory, close quote. Later, he expands on the difficulties presented by instincts, stating, quote, no doubt many instincts of very difficult explanation could be opposed to the theory of natural selection. Cases in which we cannot see how an instinct could have originated, cases in which no intermediate gradations are known to exist, cases of instincts of such trifling importance that they could hardly have been acted on by natural selection, cases of instincts almost identically the same in animals so remote in the scale of nature that we cannot account for their similarity by inheritance from a common progenitor, and consequently must believe that they were independently acquired through natural selection. With respect to the cell-making instinct of the hive bee, Darwin states that this instinct and the instinct of slave-making ants have generally and justly been ranked by naturalists as the most wonderful of all known instincts. With respect to the cell-making instinct, Darwin states, quote, he must be a dull man who can examine the exquisite nature of a comb, that is a honeycomb, so beautifully adapted to its end, without enthusiastic admiration. We hear from mathematicians that bees have practically solved a recondite problem and have made their cells of the proper shape to hold the greatest possible amount of honey with the least possible consumption of precious wax in their construction. It has been remarked that a skillful workman with fitting tools and measures would find it very difficult to make cells of wax of the true form, though this is affected by a crowd of bees working in a dark hive, close quote. With respect to the difficulty of explaining the existence of neuter ants, Darwin states it is, quote, one special difficulty, which at first appeared to me insuperable and actually fatal to the whole theory. For these neuters often differ widely in instinct and in structure from both the males and fertile females, and yet from being sterile they cannot propagate their kind, close quote. Darwin goes on to state, quote, but we have not as yet touched on the acme of the difficulty, namely the fact that the neuters of several ants differ not only from the fertile females and males, but from each other, sometimes to an almost incredible degree, and are thus divided into 2 or even 3 castes, close quote. He acknowledges, quote, it will indeed be thought that I have an overweening confidence in the principle of natural selection, when I do not admit that such wonderful and well-established facts at once annihilate the theory, close quote. Darwin concludes his discussion of the matter by stating, quote, but I must confess that with all my faith in natural selection, I should never have anticipated that this principle could have been efficient in so high a degree, had not the case of these neuter insects led me to this conclusion. I have therefore discussed this case at some little but wholly insufficient length in order to show the power of natural selection, and likewise because this is by far the most serious special difficulty which my theory has encountered, close quote. With respect to the difficulty of explaining the inability of a species to breed with another species, Darwin states, quote, it may be urged as an overwhelming argument that there must be some essential distinction between species and varieties, inasmuch as the latter, that is varieties, however much they may differ from each other in external appearance, cross with perfect facility and yield perfectly fertile offspring. With some exceptions, I fully admit that this is the rule. With respect to the absence of transitional forms in the world around us, Darwin admits that, quote, the distinctness of specific forms and their not being blended together by innumerable transitional links is a very obvious difficulty. With respect to the absence of transitional forms in the fossil record, Darwin states that under his theory, quote, as this process of extermination has acted on an enormous scale, so must the number of intermediate varieties, which have formerly existed, be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory, close quote. Darwin admits that though we do find many links, we do not find interminable varieties connecting together all extinct and existing forms by the finest graduated steps. He states, quote, that the geological record is imperfect, all will admit, but that it is imperfect to the degree required by our theory, few will be inclined to admit, close quote. He also acknowledges, quote, he who rejects the view of the imperfection of the geological record will rightly reject the whole theory, close quote. With respect to the absence of transitional forms, even within particular geological formations, Darwin states, quote, it cannot be doubted that the geological record viewed as a whole is extremely imperfect, but if we confine our attention to any one formation, it becomes much more difficult to understand why we do not therein find closely graduated varieties between the allied species which lived at its commencement and at its close quote. He confesses, quote, but I do not pretend that I should ever have suspected how poor was the record in the best preserved geological sections, had not the absence of innumerable transitional links between the species which lived at the commencement and close of each formation pressed so hardly on my theory. With respect to the sudden appearance of new forms of life in certain geological formations, Darwin states, quote, "The abrupt manner in which whole groups of species suddenly appear in certain formations has been urged by several paleontologists, for instance by Agassiz, Pictic, and Sedgwick, as a fatal objection to the belief in the transmutation of species. If numerous species belonging to the same genera or families have really started into life at once, the fact would be fatal to the theory of evolution through natural selection." Close quote. With respect to the Cambrian explosion, Darwin states, quote, "There is another and allied difficulty which is much more serious. I allude to the manner in which species, belonging to several of the main divisions of the animal kingdom, suddenly appear in the lowest known fossiliferous rocks." Close quote. Here he's referring to the Cambrian system. He states that if his theory is true, quote, "It is indisputable that before the lowest Cambrian stratum was deposited, long periods elapsed, as long as, or probably far longer than, the whole interval from the Cambrian age to the present day, and that during these vast periods the world swarmed with living creatures." Close quote. Darwin states, quote, "To the question why we do not find rich fossiliferous deposits belonging to these assumed earliest periods prior to the Cambrian system, I can give no satisfactory answer." Close quote. He states, quote, "The case at present must remain inexplicable and may be truly urged as a valid argument against the views here entertained." So we see that Darwin acknowledged that many of the objections raised by his critics were valid objections, and even acknowledged that a number of them carried great weight. I would now like to turn to the relevance for today of Darwin's response to his critics. Darwin's response has relevance in terms of both substance and procedure. Darwin's response is relevant in terms of substance because the objections raised by his critics are relevant to today's neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, and because Darwin's response to those objections is for the most part still relevant today. The neo-Darwinian theory of evolution is basically the same as Darwin's theory, except for two differences. First, Darwin believed that the first form or forms of life were produced by the Creator, whereas under the neo-Darwinian theory, the first forms of life came into existence through non-intelligent forces. Second, Darwin's ideas about the causes of variations have been updated in the neo-Darwinian theory for what has been learned in the field of genetics. However, none of the objections raised by Darwin's critics relate to one of these ways in which Darwin's theory differs from the neo-Darwinian theory. Thus, all of the critics' objections are relevant to today's neo-Darwinian theory. Moreover, Darwin's response to the objections remains relevant today, except in three respects. These are: one, his view, contrary to current scientific thought, that the flatfish's striving to move one of its eyes could produce an inherited effect. Two, new insights gained since Darwin's time as to why species cannot generally interbreed with other species. And three, new information about the length of time from the consolidation of the Earth's crust to the beginning of the Cambrian period, and from the beginning of the Cambrian period to the present day. Except in these three respects, Darwin's response remains relevant today to the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution. Darwin's response to his critics is also relevant today in terms of procedure. Darwin's response shows very clearly that he took his critics seriously and exerted great effort to respond to them thoughtfully. As indicated earlier, approximately 1/3 of the origin of species consists of Darwin's response to his critics' objections. He not only took his critics seriously, but also treated them with respect, referring to them as the most eminent paleontologists and our greatest geologists. He also honestly acknowledged that there were a crowd of difficulties with his theory, and that a number of his critics' objections carried great weight. Darwin's response to his critics makes clear that he was interested in carrying on a civilized and rational debate, taking his critics' objections seriously and responding to them not with deprecation, but with evidence and logic. In this respect, Darwin is an example for all to follow today. It was Darwin's hope that young scientists would be able to carefully consider the scientific arguments both for and against his theory. He stated, quote, "I look with confidence to the future, to young and rising naturalists who will be able to view both sides of the question with impartiality," close quote. When the rising young naturalists of our age are taught the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, they should at least learn how Darwin responded to his critics. This would introduce an element of objectivity consistent with Darwin's hope for the future. Thank you.